You know that feeling. When you're part of some big organization, maybe a political party or a union, something that started out all fired up about democracy,
Hmm.
but then somehow over time it just feels like it's run by this small, kind of closed off group at the top, an elite you can't even challenge.
Yeah, that sense that the leadership isn't really connected anymore, that they're talking to themselves.
Exactly. It's frustrating. And that exact feeling is what today's thinker, Robert Michels, really dug into.
That's right.
We're doing a deep dive into his big work, Political Parties. It's where he laid out this, well, pretty famous and frankly quite pessimistic idea called the iron law of oligarchy.
A really influential concept. Michels basically argued, very forcefully, that any large group, even one totally committed to democracy on paper, naturally,
Yeah.
almost inevitably, develops structures that aren't democratic at all.
It's a powerful idea and still feels relevant, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's been a touchstone for political skepticism for, what, over a century now?
So, our mission today is to unpack Michels's insights. They're sharp, even if, as we'll see, maybe a bit flawed. We'll look at the case study he used and then really get into the critiques of his theory and also his own pretty controversial life path.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's start with the core idea, this iron law. What's the mechanism? How does Michel say this democratic decay actually happens?
Well, what's really interesting is that Michel says it's not necessarily about bad people or, corruption, initially at least. It's more about, well, practical needs, functional necessities.
Functional necessities? Like what?
Like, as soon as a movement gets big, you need structure, right? You need organization to get anything done.
Okay, makes sense. You need offices, maybe paid staff.
Exactly. You need coordination, communication, people managing funds.
Yeah.
And that means you need specialists, full-time professionals.
Ah, okay. Accountants, press officers, organizers, people who do this as their job.
Precisely. And Mito's point is, once you have this group of full-time political pros, they become different. They form a distinct layer, a kind of cadre of functionaries.
How so? Different how?
Well, he observed that when, say, ordinary workers become these full-time officials, they kind of stop being working class in the same way. The party itself gives them a career path, maybe social mobility, definitely more security than they had before.
Right. So their own interests become tied up with the organization continuing, maybe even more than the original goals.
That's the core of it. The survival and stability of the organization becomes their primary interest. Their livelihood depends on it, even if the party isn't really changing society much anymore.
So the very things you need to be effective size, structure, dedicated staff actually create the problem.
That's the argument.
Mhm.
This professional group develops specialized knowledge. They know the rules, they control the information, the budget.
The things the average member doesn't know or doesn't have time to learn.
Exactly. And that knowledge becomes a source of power. It makes it incredibly difficult for the rank and file, the volunteers, the amateurs, to effectively challenge them, even when there are real disagreements.
Wow, okay. It's like a self-reinforcing cycle. The leaders become indispensable because they're the only ones who know how everything works.
Pretty much. Their competence, which is necessary for the organization, also entrenches their position.
This feels very, very familiar. I know the source material mentioned how this pops up in modern critiques. Where do we see Michels' ideas used today?
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
Especially when people criticize established parties, often center-left ones. You hear echoes of it in discussions about, say, historical machine politics like Tammany Hall.
Right, the party bosses.
Yeah. And then fast forward to modern times, you see similar arguments about the Democratic National Committee, especially maybe during the Clinton era, or critiques of the UK's New Labour under Tony Blair. The accusation is always similar.
That the leadership clique is running the show for its own ends, not listening to the base.
Precisely. That the party machinery itself becomes the main focus, controlled by a professional elite.
And I suppose when parties lose members, that makes it even worse. Like if the mass membership shrinks.
It absolutely can exacerbate it. We saw Labour and Social Democratic parties, which used to have huge memberships, kind of hollow out when their leaders shifted towards more neoliberal policies.
Less active members means less pushback.
Right. The structure, the machinery is still there, but with fewer active members, it becomes easier for faction leaders, the numbers men, to control things.
Okay. And this applies beyond just Western parties, right? The source mentioned communist parties, too.
Yes, that's another classic example often cited. Think about the shift in Soviet bloc countries. Parties that started as revolutionary workers' movements became run by paid apparatchiks, full-time party officials whose careers were the party.
So it reinforces Mike Elp's point. The
Yeah.
organization takes over, regardless of the original ideology.
That's the iron law argument in a nutshell.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. Michels wasn't just an armchair theorist. He based this on real-world experience, didn't he? What was his main case study?
Yes, he was deeply involved. His primary source material came from his time as an active member of the German Social Democrats, the SPD.
The SPD. That was a huge deal back then, wasn't it?
Absolutely massive. The world's first socialist party with over 1 million members. He was active from about 1902 to 1907, so he had firsthand knowledge of this giant, seemingly democratic organization.
So if the SPD was supposedly the model, what was his specific beef with its leadership? What did he see going wrong?
His main critique, his polemic really, was aimed squarely at the leaders of the German trade unions affiliated with the party.
Why them specifically?
He thought they were far too cautious. He accused them of sitting on their hands, basically. They had enormous potential power, huge strike funds, organized labor, networks of halls and offices, but they refused to use that industrial muscle for real political change against the German Empire.
Why? What was their reasoning, according to Michels?
He believed they prioritized protecting the organization itself, preserving those funds and structures, overtaking risky, potentially revolutionary actions. Organizational stability trumped radical goals.
Okay, now, let's talk about how this theory got picked up later. Because the timing seems really important. It was republished in English in 1962.
Right, with a new introduction by Seymour Martin Lipset, a major figure in American political science.
Smack bang in the middle of the Cold War. That
Yeah.
can't be a coincidence.
Definitely not. That reissue helped make political parties a kind of semi-canonical text, especially in Western universities during the Cold War.
And it served a purpose in that context.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It provided a powerful intellectual argument against socialist projects. The idea was, look, even if you start with the best intentions, your party will inevitably become an oligarchy anyway, because organizations just work that way.
So it was used to suggest that any attempt at fundamental social transformation through a party was doomed from the start. The failure was just baked in.
That was certainly how it was often interpreted and used. It cast doubt on the very possibility of democratic socialist change, blaming organizational necessity rather than, say, external pressures or specific political choices.
Okay, but now we need to look at the other side, the critiques of Michels. Because when you look closely at his work and his life, some significant limitations appear, right?
Yes, absolutely. When you put his work back into its historical and biographical context, the iron law starts to look a bit less iron.
Like what? I remember reading that he maybe downplayed the democratic aspects that did exist in the STD.
He definitely did. He tended to dismiss the quite lively internal debates they had, the open forums, the annual party conferences, which were often very contentious, and which he sometimes even took part in.
So there was pushback against the leadership.
There was. And while he focused on the paid officials as this emerging elite, you could also see those officials, the strike funds, the meeting halls, as real, tangible gains for the labor movement, the increased workers' power. But Michels wasn't that interested in those practical gains.
What was he interested in then?
He seemed more focused on maintaining a kind of constant revolutionary élan, a sort of fiery spirit. He almost idealized struggle for its own sake.
Is that what people mean by spontaneism, that critique?
Yeah, that term fits. It's the idea that pure, spontaneous mass action is the ideal, and that organization inevitably corrupts it. Michels leaned heavily in that direction, sometimes dismissing the necessary, if unglamorous, work of building and maintaining an organization.
And there's that really key biographical detail that seems to undercut his whole argument, the Marburg bias. Can you explain that?
Right, this is crucial. When Michels was developing these ideas, he was based in Marburg, a small university town.
Not exactly an industrial powerhouse.
Not at all. The local SPD branch was tiny, mostly academics and intellectuals. And the evidence suggests that in that specific group, the intellectual authority of Comrade Herr Dr. Michels, as he was known, wasn't really questioned.
Wait, so he based his universal iron law that all masses inevitably defer to leaders on his experience in a tiny group of intellectuals where he was the unchallenged leader.
That's the critical interpretation, yes. It seriously raises questions about his methodology. How universal can a law be if it's based on such a specific, maybe unrepresentative sample?
That really changes the perspective. It makes it seem less like objective sociology and more like, well, projecting his own experience.
It certainly suggests his conclusions might have been shaped by his immediate environment and perhaps by the broader intellectual climate of the time, too. the fin de siècle pessimism.
Oh, yes, the intellectual influences. He wasn't writing in a vacuum. What were the big ideas floating around that shaped his thinking?
Well, a major one was crowd psychology, particularly the work of Gustave Le Bon, who was actually anti-socialist.
Bon. What was his idea?
Le Bon wrote about the supposed irrationality of crowds, their suggestibility, their innate need to worship leaders and submit to authority. Michels seems to have taken that psychological view of passive masses and applied it directly to the members of political parties.
So the masses want to be led, according to this view.
That's a strong undercurrent, yes. And then he also drew heavily on the Italian elite theorists like Mosca and Pareto.
Right, the idea that society is always ruled by a small elite, no matter the system.
Exactly. Plus, he was friends with major German social scientists like Max Weber and Werner Sombart. This whole intellectual milieu seemed to reinforce his view that socialism was mainly an ethical project for intellectuals like himself.
And the working class.
He tended to see them as just pursuing their own narrow material interests. This view of the proletariat as inherently passive and self-interested is key to why his iron law is so deterministic and pessimistic.
Okay, so let's trace his own path. He starts with socialism, gets disillusioned with the SPD because they weren't radical enough. Where does he end up?
Well, his politics drift. He moves towards more conservative, liberal ideas, takes a professorship in Switzerland around World War I. But the really striking part is his later life.
This is the connection to fascism, right?
Yes. Michels eventually became an admirer and adherent of Benito Mussolini in Italy.
Wow, so the guy who wrote about the masses needing strong leaders found his own strong leader.
It seems that way. He ended his career, dying in 1936, as a professor at a university in Perugia that was actively being turned into an elite training ground for Italy's fascist leadership.
That personal journey, it was used later, wasn't it, to support that idea that the far left and far right are somehow close. The horseshoe theory?
It certainly provided convenient ammunition for that theory in the 1950s, yeah. Though, of course, the reality of political trajectories is always more complex.
But it does draw a really interesting contrast with someone else who criticized the German party bureaucracy around the same time, Rosa Luxemburg.
A crucial contrast. Both Michels and Luxemburg were sharp critics of the cautious trade union officials in Germany.
Right, but their conclusions were totally different.
Completely different.
Yeah.
Luxemburg saw the bureaucracy as a problem to be overcome through more democracy, through a dynamic relationship between the party and the masses. For her, mass action, strikes, debates these things, raised consciousness, educated the base, and kept the leadership accountable.
So she believed the members could learn and grow through struggle.
Exactly. She believed in the potential of the rank and file. Michels, on the other hand, stuck to his more pessimistic view, influenced by that crowd psychology idea. He seemed to believe workers were fundamentally passive and actually needed charismatic leaders to jolt them into action because they supposedly had this innate desire to hero worship.
So Luxemburg sees democracy and struggle as energizing, while Michel sees organization as inevitably crushing the spirit because the masses basically want to be led.
That's the fundamental difference. Luxemburg thought the iron law could be resisted, bent, maybe broken. Michel saw it as inescapable fate.
Okay, so wrapping this up, what should we, the listeners, take away from this deep dive into Michel's?
I think the key is nuance. Michels gave us a really powerful lens for looking at bureaucracy in any large organization. That idea about functional necessity leading towards oligarchy, you can see versions of that playing out all around us in corporations, nonprofits, political parties, you name it. It's a valuable warning. But we absolutely have to remember the flaws. His law wasn't as objective or universal as he claimed. It was shaped by his specific experiences, like in Marburg, his intellectual biases drawn from elite theory and crowd psychology, and ultimately by his own political journey towards fascism.
So the critique is useful, but the fatalism might be overstated.
Exactly. And the core issue he raises is still incredibly relevant. Think about political parties today, struggling with falling membership, leaders seeming out of touch.
Yeah, you look at debates within, say, the Democratic Party in the U.S. or the Labour Party in the U.K. about connecting with their base versus pleasing donors or the media. It feels very Michelsian.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with a big question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Michels himself seemed less committed to democracy than to this idea of a constant life of struggle.
Right.
So if his theory holds any water, if those functional necessities do push organizations towards oligarchy, What's the point of fighting for internal democracy within these groups? Is that whole struggle just, delaying the inevitable?
Or is the iron law maybe not quite so iron? Can that constant struggle, that pushback from below that Luxemburg talked about, actually bend it? Can activism keep organizations more accountable?
That's the question to ponder, isn't it? Especially the next time you find yourself dealing with the frustrations of any large, complex organization. Is oligarchy truly inevitable, or is the fight itself the point?